Well, welcome along to MCFC Fanatic, and we're going to do a bit of reminiscing today, and we're going to go back into my family's history with Manchester City, and you'll have to indulge me a little bit, Blues, because obviously I need to speak about like my granddad and my dad, and I've got a few pictures and bits and pieces. The picture that's behind me, well, that's actually a programme from the 67-68 season, and we were playing Tottenham Hotspur at home, and the Tottenham Hotspur actually played not a massive part in my life, but early doors. There were one or two stories knocking about Tottenham Hotspur, and they were actually my second team. I mean, back in the day, most football fans had a second team, didn't they? You had your main team where, you kind of lived or whatever, but you always had a bit of a soft feeling for another football club, and mine was Tottenham Hotspur. Not anymore, I might add. But so I collected programmes. I have a collection of programmes from over the years, cup final programmes, rosettes, ticket stubs, all of that kind of things. All very interesting stuff. I don't know whether my family will be interested enough to keep hold of them and do a bit of research on them. I hope they do. But and an interesting thing about the programme that's behind me, it was a shilling. Back in 1967-68, it was a shilling. Okay, let's get stuck in. So Manchester City were formed back in 1880. They weren't called Manchester City then. They were called St. Mark's. It was basically a church-based team. And that was the basis of the team. And in 1887, they changed the name to Ardwick Association FC. Yeah, a bit of a mouthful. You can see why they ended up calling themselves Manchester City, can't you? But coincidentally, 1887 is the same year that my granddad was born. And my granddad was born in June 1887 in Shoreditch in London. And, he was called Edward Rowland Polk. And this very smart gentleman is Edward Rowland Polk. I'm guessing he's probably about 18 to 20 in that picture. And of course, being born in London and living in London, he was a football fan, and his team was Tottenham Hotspur. So therein lies the link to Tottenham Hotspur. Unfortunately, he actually died the year my mother and father got married, and that was a year before I was born. So I never actually got to meet him, which is a great shame. But there you go. That's what back in those days. The life expectancy of people wasn't that great. So these days, obviously, grandparents do get to know the grandchildren quite well into later years and whatever, and that's a great thing. Like I say, back then not so much, because my granddad did die. So on the 1901 census, my granddad was down as being 13 years old, and of course in those days you didn't stay at school. Well, actually, even if you went to school, but you didn't stay at school for very long. And at 13 years old, he was actually working, and he was a fur trader. Which was it was a standard occupation in those days, a fur trader. It wasn't anything. I mean, these days, if you said somebody's a fur trader, well, for one thing, it would be very badly looked on, wouldn't it? It's not politically correct to be a fur trader these days, but it's not a thing really that it's not on the top of your agenda these days for occupations. Back in those days, it was, and he was a fur trader. And in 1911, the census in 1911 had him moving to Chorlton. Nobody knows why he moved there. I can't remember now whether I asked my father whether he, why he moved to Chorlton. I'm not quite sure. Because, I was maybe thinking the other day that it might have had something to do with the First World War, 1418. But obviously that was 3 years before the First World War started. So, 23 years old, and he moves to Chorlton, Manchester, where he meets my grandmother, Florence. And my father was born in 1916, right in the middle of the First World War. And, he was named Rowland Polk. Obviously taking my grandfather's name, but shortened. There was no Edward in there. It was just Rowland Polk. And meanwhile, back to Manchester City. And yes, in 1894, they were actually renamed Manchester City FC, and there is a big fan group now called the 1894 group in celebration of the time that they were actually named Manchester City. And yes, Blues, I am trying to get the link back to Manchester City again. I just think it's quite important that I give you because like I say, my granddad was born down south in London, had no connection whatsoever to Manchester City, being a Tottenham fan. But eventually, obviously, my dad became a Manchester City fan. And, well, he wasn't just a Manchester City fan, he was a fervent Manchester City fan. I know he used to drive my mother absolutely potty. If he wasn't at the game, he had a radio glued to his ear, listening to the commentary of the game. So I know he used to drive her absolutely potty. Well, in 1923, Manchester City moved to the 85,000 capacity. Yes, 85,000 capacity. I think it was all standing. I'm not quite sure. I think it was all standing. But 85,000 Main Road. And obviously Main Road is where my dad used to go. I started going. I used to stand in the Kippax week after week after week. And it became my second home, really, and my dad's as well, until obviously in the end we moved to the Etihad Stadium, which is where we are now. And in 1904, City were very busy winning the FA Cup. It was played at Crystal Palace down in London, and we played Bolton Wanderers, beat them 1-0, and a nice little shiny bit of silverware back in 1904. There's a nice little picture here of the team that won that trophy. In 1932, and I have a really precious photograph here of my dad and my grandfather. And obviously these days, with mobile phones, people can take like 50 photographs a day, never mind a year. Back in those days, any photographs that were taken, such that they were very, very precious if you've still got those. And my dad would have been about 15, 16 here. I mean, 2 years later, City would win the FA Cup. I don't think he went to that game. That would have been played at Wembley, I think. And I think he might have been a little bit too young. He certainly went to the 1956 FA Cup final, because I have some great stories from him about that game. But about 15, 16 here with my granddad. And by this time, they've moved to Moss Side in Manchester. So they've moved in fact, I think they moved around quite a lot. But my granddad started off in Chorlton. I don't think my dad was born in Moss Side. I'm not quite sure where he was born, which house he was born in. But this is in the back garden of a terraced house back in 1932 in Moss Side. So like I say, 1934, and I don't think my dad, because I don't know, he probably would have had trouble at that age getting down to London. I'm not too sure really. I don't ever remember him telling me about that final. But this is the Manchester City lineup of that year, and some very, very famous names in there. Tilson, Dale, Busby, Swift, Frank Swift, tremendous goalkeeper from what I've been told. Barnet Bray, McCluckey, Toseland, Marshall, Cowan, Hurd and Brook. And there's some great footballing names there, and the one that stands out the most is third from the left on the back row is Matt Busby, playing for Manchester City. He played for Liverpool as well later on in his career, but when he retired, he went to manage Manchester United. And anybody who knows the history of football will know about the Busby Babes. It was a great team that Matt Busby built for Manchester United, and unfortunately a lot of them actually died in the Munich air disaster. And that's a very interesting piece of footballing history if you want to go and do a little bit of research on that. Matt Busby actually survived that plane crash. So, and obviously he went on to manage Manchester United, for the rest of his career, really. And in 1937, that City team went on to win the First Division title. So more shiny silverware, and well, there's a thing going around at the moment. It has been for a few years now, because City have become very, very successful, and a lot of the bitter opposing fans will say Manchester City have got no history. Well, we have got history, and they're okay. We might not have won as many Premier Leagues as Manchester United, but we have got history. To say Manchester City have got no history, we certainly have. Another nice picture here of my dad in 1950, and well, obviously he wouldn't have known, but 6 years later, he was at Wembley cheering on the mighty Blues in a 3-1 win in the FA Cup final. And that 1956 final was it was the first homecoming parade, so a trophy parade. We all know about those trophy parades these days. I mean, Manchester City recently, well, we have one a year basically, because we win so many trophies. Back in those days, a trophy parade, well, it was a thing, but to be televised, the 1956 FA Cup final win was the first televised homecoming parade by Granada TV. And yeah, there were thousands and thousands of fans there, and well, a great moment, particularly for my dad. And that was kind of one of the first times I kind of spoke to him with at any length about his his past love for Manchester City. And I mean, another little tale about my dad, which I should have spoken about earlier, was that so when he was growing up, and I'm guessing that 1932 photograph probably would have been around the time, he hadn't actually settled on an allegiance. So one week he would go to Old Trafford and watch United, and the next week he would go to, because in those days it was, it was very regimented. City would play at home one week. They couldn't both play at home at the same time, because that would cause massive problems. But City would play at home one week, United would play at home the next week. And my dad used to alternate. He used to go to Manchester United one week, Manchester City the next. And he did that. I'm not quite sure how many years he did that for. But eventually he settled on the mighty Blues, and he planted his allegiance firmly in the Manchester City camp. And from there on, well, Manchester United became sworn enemies, which of course then he kind of passed that on to me. And to this day, Manchester United, to be honest, I'm only saying their name because it's on video. I don't really favour Manchester United at all. So, I got that from him. He was a very, very ardent Manchester City supporter. Once he'd actually made his mind up which team he was going to support. And once again, this is the team sheet from that final. Once again, a very, very famous Manchester City team with some very famous names in there. Bert Trautmann, the goalkeeper, more about him in a second. Bill Levers, Roy Little, Ken Barnes, was Peter Barnes' father. And all Blues will know, well, I'm saying all Blues will know, more about that later, but Peter Barnes, his son, went on to play for City and was a great winger, absolutely brilliant player. But Ken Barnes, Dave Ewing, absolutely superb player. Roy Paul. My dad would just sit and tell me all of these stories about these players and how good they were. Bobby Johnson. And I remember just sitting there in awe of his stories that he used to tell me. And the more stories he told me about Manchester City, the more I was sucked in, because he had a great way of telling these stories and, telling the little, Don Revie's in there. Don Revie became Leeds United's manager, Jack Dyson, Roy Clark, all of these players, all icons in their own way. And if you look there, there's three halfbacks there, Ken Barnes, Dave Ewing and Roy Paul. Modern fans were like, what's a halfback? Yeah, it was just a way of playing in those days. But one of the reports I've just been reading actually said the lineup was a goalkeeper, two fullbacks, one centre half, two wing back. I mean, it sounds like a team invented by Pep Guardiola, and that's back 70 years ago. Absolutely bonkers. But yeah, absolutely brilliant team there, and Bert Trautmann is a name that, we need to talk about Bert Trautmann basically. So the Bert Trautmann story is a fascinating tale. If you want to Google it, and there's lots of documentaries, there's been films made about his life. Fascinating story. He was an absolutely superb goalkeeper for Manchester City. And, anybody who knows about football, you mentioned Bert Trautmann, they'll know his name. So basically, he was a German, and he joined the Hitler Youth movement in his early years. And when World War II broke out, he joined the Luftwaffe, became a German pilot. And he did get shot down when he was on one of his sorties over England. And he ended up in a prisoner of war camp in Ashton in Manchester. When the war came to an end, he actually refused repatriation. He wanted to stay in England. And of course, he had been a goalkeeper back in Germany. And he worked his way through and became became Manchester City's goalkeeper. But his early career was fraught with problems because obviously he was a German paratrooper, a German Luftwaffe pilot, and he was obviously the enemy. And a lot of people were very, very unhappy. There is a great film about his life and it explains it in really good detail. But a lot of people were really, really unhappy. Even the City fans were extremely unhappy that we had a German prisoner of war playing in goal for us. But eventually his heroics, proved to be, it swung the Manchester City faithful. And in the end, every Manchester City fan absolutely loved him. He actually played in a cup final with a broken neck. And believe it or not, they came on, gave him treatment, and they said, yeah, you're okay to carry on. They didn't know he broke his neck, and he carried on playing in that game and made a few saves, believe it or not. It was only after the game that he had some x-rays done, and he'd broken his neck. So, I mean, what a player Bert Trautmann was. And I've got an image here of, he had a testimonial in 1964 for City, and it was basically an England 11 versus a combined Manchester City and Manchester United 11. And I was at that game. Me and my dad stood at the back of the Kippax, and I was at that game. But more about that later. I'm actually jumping the gun a little bit here. So I know you're all chomping at the bit saying, okay, where does your association with Manchester City come in? Well, I was born in 1952. And obviously my dad, like I say, he was an ardent Manchester City fan. He went to, in those days, basically, let me just explain this. So 1 week, the first team would play at home. And then the next week, the reserve team would play at home. We had no kind of EDS in those days. It was just the reserves. And it would be a second 11, basically. So my dad would go to both. He would go to the first team game 1 week. The next week, he would go to the reserve team game. And some away games, he would go to those, certainly go to Wembley and all of that kind of thing. And like I say, if we were playing an away game like midweek or whatever, he'd have a transistor radio to his ear and he'd be glued to he was absolutely bonkers on football. And I know it used to cause massive arguments with my mother. So back to my involvement, and about the age of 3 or 4, I mean, I've been told these stories. Obviously, I don't remember that kind of, time of my life, but I've been told these stories. And at the time, I mean, for until I moved out to get married, in fact, we lived in a little terraced house in Levenshulme, which was about 3 miles from Main Road. So a couple of bus rides, and my dad used to go out every Saturday because it was first team 1 week, reserves the next, sometimes even midweek games. But of course, I'd not seen him all week, and I mean, neither had my mother to that point, but he still used to go, and he used to set off about 1 o'clock for a 3 o'clock kickoff, and he would shut the living room door behind him. And the story goes is that I would cry myself to sleep behind the door, and I suppose it must have got to a point where my dad was told these stories, and he thought, well, you know what? I'll take him with me. And I think I started going from a fairly early age, if I'm honest. I mean, more about that later. I'm actually jumping the gun a little bit here. But yeah, I used to cry myself to sleep behind the door. And I think crying myself to sleep behind the door is a good jumping off point, to be quite honest, because as the years move on now, obviously, like I say, I'm sure my dad heard these stories, decided to start taking me. I think probably from the ages of about 7 or 8. I remember going and, well, I'm not going to tell you any more because that's for the next episode, but plenty of stories to come along now as my memories start to click in, and obviously we've got the great team coming up, the Belley Summerby team put together by Malcolm Allison and Joe Mercer, or I should say it the other way around really, shouldn't I? Joe Mercer and Malcolm Allison. But I came onto the Manchester City scene, to be honest, just at the right time, and they were great years, great memories, going all over the country with my dad, Wembley visits. My brother was born, he became a Manchester City fan, but again, I'm jumping the gun. That's all for future episodes. So I hope you've enjoyed it today, and some quite nice memories. I know it's been a bit self-indulgent because I've had a lot of my like family history in there, but the next episode will be more tales, future tales of my involvement with the Mighty Blues. We'll see you very shortly.